There are countless teachings that people accept without questioning, traditions passed down from generation to generation that have become so deeply rooted in religious practices that many follow them blindly. One of those practices is tithing. The moment someone hears the word, they immediately think of obligation, duty, and the fear of disobeying God if they fail to give a certain percentage of their income. But the truth is this: God never said you must tithe. What God desires from you is not a forced act of giving, but a willing heart that pours out with gratitude, faith, and love. When you truly understand the heart of God, you realize that He does not demand from you in order to bless you. He blesses you first, He pours into you first, and then He invites you to respond in faith. Tithing was never meant to be a legalistic burden, but a symbol of relationship. Yet many have turned it into a mechanical rule, forgetting that God is after the heart, not the percentage. What use is 10% from a reluctant heart? What value is a gift given with bitterness or fear? The Creator of the heavens and the earth, who owns all things, cannot be enriched by your money. What He seeks is your trust, your faith, and your willingness to put Him first, not by compulsion, but by love. True prosperity is never found in ritualistic obedience, it is found in the heart of faith. When you give, it should not be because you are told you must, but because you choose to honor the one who has already supplied every need. The principle is not tithing, the principle is trust. Do you trust that God is your provider? Do you believe that He is the one who gives you strength, wisdom, and opportunities? If so, then giving becomes natural, not forced. You no longer measure generosity by 10%, you measure it by your heart of gratitude and the love that flows from your spirit. Those who live under the weight of law live under bondage. They count every coin, they fear every shortage, and they give out of compulsion. But those who walk in grace understand freedom. They know that God is not a tax collector, but a father. A father does not demand, a father invites. A father delights not in obligation, but in joyful sharing. When you give from this place of freedom, you step into a higher realm of blessing, because you are no longer bound by rules. You are driven by revelation. The secret is this: God wants to be first in your life. That does not mean calculating a tenth, it means surrendering everything. Your time, your resources, your talents, your very life. If He is truly first, then giving is never a struggle, because everything you have already belongs to Him. You are only a steward, not an owner. And when you live as a steward, you experience abundance that no human law of giving could ever create. Stop thinking in terms of what you must do and start thinking in terms of what you want to do for God. When your heart is right, your giving will be right. When your faith is strong, your generosity will flow without resistance. When your love for God is genuine, you will not ask, "How much must I give?" but rather, "How much can I give?" That is the difference between law and grace, between bondage and freedom, between fear and faith. So let go of the weight of obligation. Release the chains of tradition that make you feel guilty if you fail to give a fixed amount. Instead, step into the liberty of the Spirit, where giving is an act of joy, not duty. When you do this, you will see that God's blessings do not flow because you met a requirement, but because you walked in faith. And faith, when lived fully, always opens the door to provision, abundance, and peace. Remember, the measure of your generosity is not counted by men, nor by institutions, nor by legalistic rules. It is measured by the God who sees your heart. And when your heart beats with love for Him, you will give freely, joyfully, abundantly, not because you must, but because you are overflowing with gratitude for all He has done. That is the life of faith. That is the life of freedom. That is the true blessing God desires for you. The most important key point in this message is that God never intended giving to be an obligation enforced by law, but a willing expression of trust and love from the heart. To expand on this, we must dig deep into the essence of faith, the meaning of generosity, and the difference between living under law and living under grace. Many people live their entire spiritual lives with the wrong picture of God because they see Him as a strict ruler who is more concerned with numbers and rules than with the intentions of the heart. They live with fear that if they do not give exactly 10% of their income, they will lose His blessing or fall into judgment. But when you study the true heart of God, you realize that He is not a God of compulsion but of freedom. He is not looking for forced obedience. He is looking for genuine surrender that comes from love. Think about a parent and a child. A parent who forces their child to say, "I love you," every single morning at 8 o'clock sharp would never experience true love from that child. Those words would be empty because they were demanded, not given freely. But when the child runs to the parent on their own, wraps their arms around them, and says, "I love you," the parent's heart is moved, not because the child fulfilled a requirement, but because it came from the child's heart. The same is true with God. If you give Him a tenth of your income because you are afraid not to, you are like that child who speaks empty words out of duty. But when you give because your heart is overflowing with gratitude for His blessings, then your giving is alive, powerful, and pleasing to Him. The principle here is faith. Faith is not about performing rituals, faith is about trust. When you trust God as your ultimate provider, you no longer calculate your generosity by percentages. You no longer fear that giving will leave you lacking. Instead, you know that every resource you have comes from Him, and when you give, you are only returning to Him what already belongs to Him. Faith transforms giving from an act of loss into an act of partnership. You no longer see money leaving your hands. You see seeds being planted into the hands of the Creator, seeds that will grow into blessings far greater than what you gave. But faith cannot operate in an atmosphere of fear. If you are giving only because you fear being cursed if you don't, you are not giving in faith. You are giving in bondage. And anything done in bondage lacks power because it does not spring from the heart. God is not moved by mechanical rituals. He is moved by living faith. That is why Scripture says without faith it is impossible to please Him. Faith is the currency of heaven, not fear, not legalism, not obligation. This is why Jesus Himself criticized the religious leaders of His time. They were experts at giving tithes. They calculated every herb, every spice, every coin, making sure the numbers were exact. Outwardly, they were perfect in their tithing. But inwardly, their hearts were corrupt, cold, and far from God. Jesus made it clear that their focus on legalistic details made them blind to the true heart of God, which is mercy, love, and justice. What use is giving 10% if your heart is not surrendered? What use is following a formula if your life is not transformed? God would rather have 1 coin given in faith and love than 1,000 coins given in fear and tradition. True giving is never about the amount, it is about the spirit behind it. A wealthy man can give millions and yet give nothing if his heart is absent. A poor widow can give 2 small coins and yet give everything because her heart is fully in it. God does not look at numbers the way men do. Men measure generosity by size, God measures it by spirit. And this is where many miss the point. They believe that giving 10% is enough to secure their blessing, but God is not impressed with percentages. He is looking for hearts that are fully surrendered, hearts that give not because they must, but because they love. When you understand this, giving stops being a burden and becomes a joy. You no longer approach it as something painful to do, something that empties your pocket. Instead, you see it as a privilege, an opportunity to partner with God, to invest in His kingdom, to bless others, and to express your gratitude for His provision. This shift in perspective is life-changing. It takes you out of a mindset of scarcity and moves you into a mindset of abundance. You stop worrying about what you lose and start focusing on what God can do with what you give. The beauty of this principle is that it applies to every area of life, not just money. God is not only asking for your finances, He is asking for your time, your talents, your energy, your love. When you give Him your attention in prayer, not because you must, but because you love to, It transforms your spiritual life. When you serve others not because it is required, but because your heart longs to show God's love, your service carries power and influence. When you offer forgiveness, not because you are forced to, but because you are overflowing with God's grace, that forgiveness heals and restores. Everything you give freely from the heart multiplies. Everything you give grudgingly withers. This is why understanding that the difference between law and grace is vital. The law says you must, grace says you are free. The law demands, grace invites. The law binds, grace releases. Under the law, giving is an obligation. Under grace, giving is a privilege. When you live under grace, you no longer ask, "What must I do?" Instead, you ask, "What can I do?" You no longer give the bare minimum, you give from abundance. You no longer measure your life by requirements, you measure it by relationship. And relationship is the key. God is not looking for slaves who obey commands out of fear. He is looking for sons and daughters who respond to His love with love. Sons and daughters give not because they must, but because their Father has already given them everything. They live in trust, knowing that the Father's supply is endless. They live in freedom, knowing that nothing they give will ever leave them lacking. They live in joy, knowing that giving is not about loss, but about sharing in the nature of God Himself. For God is the greatest giver, and when you give freely, you reflect His very character. Look at creation itself. The sun gives its light every day without ever asking for payment. The rain waters the earth freely without demanding anything in return. The trees bear fruit not because they are forced, but because it is in their nature to give. Everything in creation reflects the heart of a generous God who delights in giving. So when you give freely, you align yourself with the very flow of creation, and abundance follows you because you are walking in harmony with God's design. This is why it is dangerous to reduce giving to a formula like tithing. A formula kills the spirit. It makes people lazy, thinking they have done enough just by meeting the requirement. It traps them in a cycle of fear and guilt. But when you remove the formula, when you step into grace, you enter a realm where giving has no limits, no restrictions, no fear. You give as the Spirit leads, and you experience blessings that no formula could ever produce. And let us be clear, blessings are not always about money. Sometimes the greatest blessings come in the form of peace, joy, health, strong relationships, wisdom, and opportunities. When you give freely, you open the door for God to bless you in ways far beyond material wealth. You sow seeds not only for financial provision, but for a life filled with purpose, fulfillment, and abundance in every area. So remember, God never said you must tithe. What He wants is far greater than that. He wants your heart, your trust, your faith, your love. He wants you to give not because you are forced, but because you are free. And when you live in that freedom, your giving becomes powerful, your life becomes abundant, and your relationship with God becomes alive. That is the true principle of generosity. Not numbers, not percentages, not laws, only faith, love, and freedom. When you give from this place, you will discover a richness in life that cannot be measured, a joy that cannot be contained, and a blessing that cannot be limited. And that is the essence of what it means to live in the fullness of God's grace. God never placed you under the bondage of rules to measure your faith by a percentage. He never demanded tithes as a law to control you, but instead invited you into a life of freedom, trust, and love. What He desires is not a reluctant tenth, but a surrendered heart that gives joyfully because it knows every blessing already flows from Him. When you shift from obligation to gratitude, from law to grace, from fear to faith, your giving becomes alive and powerful. You stop asking, "What must I give?" and start declaring, "What can I give for the one who has given me everything?" That is when generosity overflows, abundance follows, and your life reflects the true nature of God Himself,